All right, welcome Heroes to Hive students. It is, what are we at, June now? This is our June Q&A session for the month. I appreciate all the questions that have been coming in. A lot of good questions this month. So before we get started, a couple things I just wanted to mention. We do have a fundraising campaign going on right now this week during Pollinator Week, the 22nd through the 28th, where BASF is going to be donating $1 to Heroes to Hives for every like or share that we have of a Facebook post that they're doing promoting our program. So if there's details in the email about this, I would really appreciate you going onto our Facebook page and liking this post and sharing it with your networks. Again, every dollar or every share or like we get on this post, we get an extra $1 of a $5,000 donation. So they're giving us $5,000 for the program, and then they'll give us an additional $5,000 or up to $5,000 if we can get 5,000 shares and likes this week on that post. So please do that for us. This program, although you all are getting this program for free, this program does cost us quite a lot to run at Michigan State University Extension. And so we really rely on these donations in order to be able to keep this program free for veterans and their dependents. So we appreciate your support on that. A couple things real quick, just all letting you know that, things that we have been talking about as far as COVID and cancellation of classes are still in effect. I have been getting some emails from a few of you wondering if, because the orders are changing at the state level, if that's going to change things for Heroes to Hives. Unfortunately, no, is the answer to that. MSU Extension is who tells us what we can and cannot do, and the big MSU overall. And so we have been instructed that all classes through September 1st, face-to-face interactions at all are to still be canceled. So if that changes, I will let you know, but I do not anticipate that changing. In fact, there's some signals that I've been seeing that we may actually be seeing an extension of this policy throughout the end of the year. So we're not going to be having on-ground programming this year. I can pretty much guarantee that. But if anything does change, I will let you know immediately. So there's no need to email me about that. I will let you know. Trust me. If we can do on-ground programming, that would make my life a whole lot easier, because developing all this digital content for you all is very time-consuming. Very time-consuming to get all of this into a video form that's presentable to you all. So just to let you know that. Other things that are going on, just to kind of give you kind of an up-to-date on what's happening in the apiaries right now. So again, I'm up here in the UP. We're just starting to see clover come on. So white Dutch clover has started flowering. We have been seeing bird's foot trefoil flowering. We are just starting to see the sweet clovers come on. So yellow and white sweet clover, we have a field of that here at my farm. That's just starting to come on. So we're starting to get into kind of our honey flow right now here in the UP. And we just got a whole bunch of rain today. You can see I'm in a hoodie today. It's kind of cool outside today. And so we're going to have a pretty decent honey flow here coming up. The last few weeks, though, we had a period of time where you guys saw these videos that I've done where we were seeing some pollen-bound situations in some of our colonies. Interesting thing, it dried up completely up here in the UP over the course of the last couple of weeks. And when I was going back to my nukes that we were selling to kind of check on them before they were going to their buyers, what we were noticing is that a lot of those really heavy pollen frames had been completely utilized. And we were actually seeing some situations where we had to actually supplementally feed some pollen. And that's just because of the dearths that we see. A lot of times here in our area of the UP, what we see in the central eastern UP is a lot of times we'll see flow come on very early, which is a lot of our apple trees and fruit trees. And then you'll see a dearth, and then you'll see it come on heavy again with a good honey flow after that. So that's something that we saw here in the last month. As far as lectures or workshops for this month, so I'm continually recording things. I've got a couple workshops already in the camera and just need to be down to editing. But the workshop topics this year, so I'm going to be going over how to use a Hive tool, doing a full Hive inspection. So I'm going to show you exactly how to do a complete Hive inspection. I'm going to be showing you how to do both types of varroa mite testing, both the powdered sugar roll and the alcohol wash. And I'm going to be demonstrating to you how to build those things as well. So how to build an alcohol wash kit or how to build your own powdered sugar roll kit. Pretty simple solutions. The alcohol wash kit, you know, I think one of the challenges that with that is getting two things that connect to one another, but we'll go over that in that video. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to be covering combining a weak hive or a hive that has gone queenless as well. And actually, I have it on my list as combining a weak hive or a queenless hive. This is a topic that comes up a lot after splits because sometimes you do have queens that don't take, or colonies that don't make queens, or colonies that make queens and the queen goes on her flight, mating flight, and never comes back. And so combining hives this time of the year is something that you can do. And I'll talk about that. There is actually a question here directed at that. But those are the videos that I'm working on right now to get to you by the end of the month. So that's what you can expect this month is the understanding of how to do a complete inspection. And then the big one, also how to do a varroa mite test. And then, and I may have mentioned this or not. The other thing I'm going to try to work on is doing a site tour of our apiary. So I'm going to kind of show you the workshop, kind of the tools that I use for doing beekeeping. I'll bring you into our honey house, which is actually currently under construction, but you'll be able to see kind of where we have things set up. And I'll bring you kind of a tour through the apiary to kind of see what we've got set up as far as fencing and things like that. So kind of a general tour of the apiary. So that's what's going on for this month. And again, I'm trying to get those out by the end of the month. Give me a few days latitude. You know, sometimes it does take a little bit longer. Our main challenge here with all of this is that I can't go to my office. So MSU is not allowing us to work from our offices. And so I'm working from home and we're on satellite internet. So a lot of times the uploading and downloading of these videos takes a long time to do in addition to the editing. But again, it'll be around the end of the month, hopefully by the end of the month. But if not, it'll be definitely by the 1st or so, something like that. So, all right. So that's what you have to look forward to. That'll be around next weekend that those will go out. All right. So let's jump into our questions for today. Again, really appreciate the questions you all have been sending in. I kind of have set back a little bit because I wanted to get a good basis of questions set up for this Q&A, and you all definitely delivered on that. So let's get into it. All right, so I'm going to go through, we had 3 lectures that I found questions on. If you did post questions to making a plan to a varroa, for a varroa, or, well, the 2 lectures that Megan gave. If you put questions in one of those things, feel free to email me those questions. There's a lot of comments on those pages, and I don't have the time to go through all of those old comments to fish out where there are Heroes to Hives comments. So if you do have a question from one of those, please feel free to email me. I can add that into the next Q&A or just answer you directly. Oh, one other thing. So some of you have been calling my cell phone with questions. That's usually not a problem, and I will give you a call back if you do leave me a voicemail. I just want you to understand where we live in the UP, I do not get cell phone reception. So if you leave me a voicemail, I do not get those messages until I go into town to retrieve those, and I do that every few days. The best way to contact me for anything is email, because we do get internet access regularly up here, but cell phone reception is very sketchy. So if you need a question answered, please email me. I mean, you can call my phone, but it may take me a few days to get back to you. Just wanted to put that out there. All right, so let's jump into the questions. All right, spring reversals of overwintered colonies. This is where we went through the process of setting your colonies up so that they get ready for splits by reversing them. Essentially, we take the top portion of the colony where the cluster's at, and we move it to the bottom and then give them space on top. All right, so do you tend to find much burr comb on overwintered hives? I noticed a small amount on one of those frames, but nothing crazy. What is your recommendation for approach for dealing with burr comb? Okay, so, well, you have to think about when comb is really being put on. So comb usually is put on when there's heavy honey flow because the wax glands are being stimulated during that time. Usually over winter, they're not making any comb at all. So the comb is not being developed during then. Their priority is staying warm, staying in a cluster and thermoregulating. So that's usually not an issue coming out of winter. The thing that really, when it comes to burr comb, is that that's something you have to manage. So some beekeepers don't do anything about it, and it's fine if you don't, but it's going to build up, and it's gonna be between frames, it's gonna be between boxes, it's gonna be between everything where there's space that's not bee space, right? So you're gonna have burr comb no matter what. The thing is that you can manage burr comb. So you have to remove it. So if you start early, like early in the season as a colony is building up and you see burr comb coming up, you just scrape it off with your hive tool. If you don't, they will continue building, and you can get to a situation where you have, solid sets of comb between upper and between frames, between a top and bottom frame. So that's something that you manage. That's the approach with dealing with burr comb. If you want to let it go, you can. It's just going to create a mess later on as they continue to build it. And, resources are going in there a lot of times. So, when you're in a brood box, oftentimes it's drone brood that's put into that brood comb, which is not a big deal to get rid of a drone brood. Varroa mite likes to hang out in there. So that's always a place where, if you're removing that material, it's not a bad thing. If you start seeing burr comb between honey supers, they will store honey in there. And so you're losing that honey. So it is something you want to manage. All right, is there a concern regarding that mold on the few frames in the bottom box and the box above it on that one frame? Okay, so this is referring to some molds. Probably this is black mold that you saw on probably the tops of the frames. That black mold is just due to moisture content within that hive. It's not something that's going to harm anything. Generally, the bees will clean up just about everything, particularly on the frames, but this is not something to be worried about. So it goes on to say, in the end, you mentioned about taking time off for splits week and picking up your new queens. Can your existing hives be manipulated and encouraged to produce queens and forego the expense of buying queens? Risks, rewards, or is it simply too expensive, or is it simply an expense one should plan on for the spring? Okay, so this is a good question. So I took off that week to do splits because we had bought queens and we needed to install them, and that's when we had planned on doing our splits. Now, I could have foregone that completely. The however many dollars I spent for 50 queens, I could have completely foregone that, and I could have had them make their own queens. Absolutely. The reason that we put a frame of eggs in a nuke or in a split is because you want them to be able to have both a young workforce, but if you are not going to be introducing a queen, that's where they're going to be producing their queens from, is they're going to be switching those young larvae over to queen diet and raise them as a queen. So you can, but there's risks to all of this, right? So I'm in the UP. If I were to have done walkaway splits without introducing a queen during that time, there are still cycles of frost that are occurring. And in fact, on a few of the nukes that I just went through this week, we had some chilled brood in them, where the cluster was too small to be able to thermoregulate the entire brood chamber, and we lost a little bit of brood. So it's something to keep in mind, is that when you're doing splits, you're also dealing with weather. The weather has to be warm enough for them to be able to maintain brood temperature. The weather has to be good enough for when that virgin queen emerges that she can go and take a mating flight. And a lot of times for us, because we did this at the last week of May, a lot of times we can still get very cold weather in the UP into June. And so instead of myself taking on the risk of them making queens and then those queens not being able to take a mating flight, or there not being a drone population large enough in my area at that time of the year to support mating, I went ahead and purchased queens. Now, if I didn't do that, if I decided to let them raise their own queens, it also puts me back. So it takes from the time a queen is laid to the time she is mated in laying again, about 4 weeks. By introducing a queen, I am way ahead of the game. So instead of me waiting for those 4 weeks for my queen to get raised, for her to be mated, and for her to come back and start laying, it would have taken me more weeks. And so from my perspective as a nuke producer, my customers want their nukes right around now for the UP. They don't want to wait until July. And the only way I can get them queen right nukes at that time of the year is by purchasing queens. So that's why we did that. Absolutely, it totally works the other way. And I've done that a lot. And in fact, when we were beekeeping in Lansing, that's pretty much how I did things, because the weather warms up a lot earlier in the season. And so you can get those queens out and get them mated and get them back without bad weather to prevent any of that. So that's why we did the things that we did. It is not an expense you have to plan for, but I would say if you are in the UP or if you are in the northern part of Michigan and you want to get your colonies off and running early in the season, yeah, it's something you should plan for. If you're not so concerned about that and you're just increasing the size of your apiary and maybe just trying to keep the genetics within your apiary stable and the same, you can do it the other way. But the other thing you have to keep in mind as well is that when I'm doing this, I'm also introducing new genetics into my apiary, right? And the way that we market our nukes is a lot of our customers really like to have Varroa sensitive hygienic queens. Now, over time, any Varroa sensitive hygienic queen that I have in my apiary, over time, over the years, even of doing splits and raising queens, those genetics get diluted. And so these customers are getting, really strong Varroa sensitive hygienic queens, the Poline queens that we used this year. And a lot of our customers really like having that kind of genetics in our apiary. Michigan mutts are also something that we sell. So we market our nukes in different ways. Some folks are really focused on having Michigan genetics. And so I have nukes that we sell that are Michigan mutts. And they're Michigan mutts because they're multi-generational colonies that have had queens that have been raised here in Michigan from overwintered colonies and bred here in Michigan as well. But I have no idea what those genetic profiles look like because, again, genetics get diluted as we continue to get away from the source of those genetics, and breeding happens over and over again. They're constantly introducing new genes. And so the stable genetics that we had hoped for with a Varroa sensitive hygienic queen, they get lost over time. But a lot of people like those queens that have been bred from stock in Michigan. Now, I'll tell you this, I have done overwintered queens and bred them, or I've done queens that have been bred from overwintered stock here in Michigan. I've done queens from California, like I did this year. I've done queens from the South as well. I will tell you that the type of queen that you have has very, very little impact on your success. There are nuanced differences between these queens. The Varroa sensitive hygienic queens are kind of nice for Varroas, for dealing with Varroa, but they're more expensive. But I have never had a problem with any genetic line surviving in Michigan, whether it had a queen from Michigan, a queen that was bred in Michigan, a queen that was from California. It usually doesn't matter. A strong queen is a strong queen. And that's what you're looking for, is a strong queen. The other nuanced differences are kind of fall into place later on, especially as you get more experienced. And like I had mentioned in one of the videos, the Saskatraz line of queens, which is one line of queen we have here, and one of our breeder lines that we continue to breed overwintered, or continue to breed queens from overwintered Saskatraz bees. That's one line of bees, but there are nuanced differences with that. But again, don't get hung up on the genetics of things. That is usually something that, later on, as you're breeding queens and things like that, and you're looking for certain qualities that you'll get more and more into. But yeah, producing queens, you can, or you don't have to. Again, it's a preferential choice. For us, it's timing more than anything. All right, so that rounded out our spring reversals. Let's go on to our splits lecture. So why did my nuke make new drone cells at the bottom of the frame when there was plenty of space on the frames? Is it okay to scrape them off when they're on the bottom of the frame? Yeah, they're just filling out space, right? So if this is the very bottom frame of your colony, or bottom box of your colony, the first brood box on top of that bottom board, there's more space below that bottom board than there is generally between frames. And so they will oftentimes put comb on that. And oftentimes when you're making burr comb, they tend to make drone comb. And so, yes, you can remove that. That's not a problem. You removing drones from your colony is not going to really have an impact on your colony. Again, drones don't forage, drones are fed. They have one purpose in life, and that's mating with the queen. So they're usually more of a resource suck on a colony. They're obviously necessary to keep producing bees, but yeah, if you see them on the bottom of the frame, you're good to remove them. And that's generally, so I can't tell you why they didn't make it on your frames. Sometimes foundation acceptance can be an issue. If that is an issue, I would recommend putting some beeswax on that foundation. If the foundation does not have a beeswax coating, oftentimes bees will choose to draw comb off of other materials than your foundation. So you can take some melted beeswax, put it on a sponge brush, and just kind of sponge it onto the foundation, and that will help encourage drawing of those foundations. Okay, let's see here, what question are we on? Number 2 here. Okay, does adding a queen from somewhere else devalue a nuke versus raising and using a local queen, or just making a nuke from a walkaway split? Okay, so no, it does not devalue it. Again, people get really hung up on queens, and I want to encourage you not to get hung up on queens. You want a young, mated, vigorous queen. It doesn't matter if she came from Michigan. It doesn't matter if she came from California. It does not matter. And no, it does not devalue the nuke. Although I do think there's a big perception with a lot of people that if they buy something that, a queen that was raised from Michigan stock, we call them Michigan mutts, because again, you can have no way to tell what they mated with after they got here to Michigan. And most of them didn't start here. So no matter what you're dealing with a Michigan mutt. So a lot of people get hung up on the fact that they need to have a queen from Michigan. That is not going to give you more success with overwintering. It is good because you're supporting the local bee market, but again, it's not something that's going to devalue a nuke. Absolutely not. And there is way more demand on nukes than there is supply. So, the nuke prices are very strong and they rarely go low. Usually when you see folks selling nukes for very cheap, it's very inexperienced beekeepers, but generally about $150 to $200 a nuke. How long after you build a nuke and give it a queen is it ready to be sold? Well, that's a big question. You have to monitor that as a beekeeper. So generally, I will not sell my nukes until they are queen right, heavy laying, and they are full of resources. Generally, for me, we did splits the last week of May, and this weekend we sold our last bit of nukes. And those nukes were fully queen right. She was laying. There was lots of food in them, lots of brood of all stages, and that's what I look for. Is just you want to make sure that you have a queen right colony that has been functioning well for several weeks and has all the resources that you have promised your customer, which essentially is a fully functioning bee colony, meaning all stages of brood, queen right colony with pollen and with nectar. Now, sometimes there's issues with pollen in some situations. We had a situation this last weekend where I had to add a little bit of pollen substitute to some of the hives. They had pollen in them, but they were getting pollen light because we've had a little bit of a dearth here. So you just need to be able to tell when the colony is good to go, when it's a fully functioning colony. The next part of this is, do you designate specific hives to do large amounts of splits, or can you still expect to harvest honey off of the original colony? You have to do splits. I want to impress that upon you, all of you. Some of you, I've seen questions, and we'll get to a couple of them, where there's this idea that you have the option to not do splits. Splitting is whether you decide to do splits or not, the colony is going to split. Any strong colony, their natural instinct is to reproduce as a colony, and we call that swarming. Now, you will either end up with a swarm or you will prevent a swarm by doing something like splits. So you have to understand that this is not like you saying, oh, I'm just not going to split this season. A strong colony will split regardless if you want it to or not. And the reason we do splits is because we're basically managing that swarm impulse. So instead of you losing half of your bees, you're taking those half of bees, you're putting them into another colony, and now you have two colonies. So that's really what we're going after with this. It's not really an optional thing. You're going to have to do swarm prevention no matter what, because it's the natural instinct of honeybees to come out of a duration like winter and reproduce as a colony. So one colony becomes 2 or 3. All right, so do you designate, this was that same, so no, I don't designate colonies to do large amounts of splits on. I know some of my colonies are just big producers, like the Saskatraz colonies that I have. I know I will get multiple splits from each one, but I have no idea how many. I know that some of my colonies will have 4 or 5 splits. I know others may have 2 or 3. I know some might have 1 or 2, just depending on the strength of the colony. And yes, after the split, you will still expect a honey harvest. So those colonies, like we had in the video where I took 7 or 8 splits from, those are also going to be my biggest honey producing colonies. They always are. Usually off of those colonies, I end up getting somewhere between 200 and 250 pounds of honey off of each one after splits. And right now, those colonies that you saw, that one that we went through in I think it was 7 or 8 splits we got from it, that colony right now is already 7 boxes tall again. So that colony we're absolutely going to harvest honey off of it. This is not an either or situation. The reason we do splits is to prevent the swarming and to be able to keep our bees rather than losing them. So it's a part of swarm prevention, and it's also a part of reproduction of colonies and how we produce bees for sale across the state of Michigan and across the world. All right, so next question, a few questions. Okay, so were you placing the top back on the original hive while you worked the individual boxes? No, I was not. In fact, the top was, no, the top was not on there. You saw, I think in total, that whole process took about 45 minutes to get through from start to finish. The bees at the end of it, and I don't think I showed you the end of it because it was just too much video to upload onto YouTube. But and by the end of it, the bees were getting a little bit testy, but they were open the whole time. All right, so where'd you go here? Oh, okay, so next question was, if you do not want to grow your operation, what do you do with a hive that needs to be split? You split it, and then you sell the nuke. So that is, you are not, this is not an optional thing. The colony is going to build so fast in the spring because it is the natural impulse for it to reproduce. It's just like any other kind of animal that comes out of the winter and starts mating in the spring and reproducing. It is their natural way of reproducing as a colony. You're not going to be able to change that. So if you don't want to grow your operation, you split the colony and then sell it. All right, can you prevent a hive from growing too big in the first place and still ensure its health? Again, the colony is going to grow because that is the natural impulse of the colony, is to reproduce as a colony. So you can prevent swarming by certain ways. So like the Demaree method that we had mentioned earlier, that is a way to prevent swarming. But the swarm prevention, that's what we're trying to do with all of this, is swarm prevention. It's a multi-stage process. So to prevent swarms, what do? You do a hive reversal in the spring, where you're making sure that there's space above the cluster so that they can continue to build out. And then after they build out, you split the colony because the colony is going to be too full at that point. Once you split the colony, that colony will still continue to grow. And sometimes even the colonies you split will have to be split again to reduce the chances of swarming. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to use methods to alleviate space limitations because the colonies grow so big. In a natural setting, what happens? Colony is in a tree. That colony cannot expand because there's no way to add more room in that colony, right? That's overwintered in a tree. It can't have a beekeeper come out and add more space on top. What it has is what it has as far as space. And that's the natural situation of honeybees. Once that organism comes through the winter as a superorganism, it quickly starts filling out. The queen starts laying prolifically. And at some point, they're going to outgrow their space where there's competition for brood and for honey and pollen. And once that space limitation gets filled, that's when the colony gets to the point where it's going to swarm. And a colony in a tree will swarm every single year because they can't accommodate all of those bees that are coming on so quickly. So really, the way to prevent a hive from growing too big in the first place is through splits. And that is the way you still ensure its health. Splitting is not going to harm the colony at all. It is a completely natural process. We're just helping it along so that we're not losing bees in the process. Okay, the last part of this, if you miss your queen during a split, could you end up with 2 queens in one and no queen later? I presume you catch that in a couple days when you check on them. Will the hives be okay if that happens? Ideally, you want to see the queen during your split. And during that colony that I went through, I did end up finding the queen. Sometimes it takes a little more effort. If you do end up with 2 queens, they're going to battle it out. And you could end up in a situation where they hurt one another enough to where they're not valid queens, or maybe you have one that kills one and you end up getting queen right. But there may be the situation where you get no queen. So yes, you could end up with any of those situations, but that's why we come back to the colonies generally. If you're unsure where the queen is, so if you were not able to locate the queen and you want to do a split, I would do a split, not introduce the queen, but rather just do a walk-away split without any queen introduction, and then come back to those colonies in 3 days, and you'll know which one has a queen, because one's going to have eggs and one's going to not have eggs. And then at that time, you could introduce your queen, or you could just let them raise their own queen from that frame of eggs that you put into your split. So, generally, the way that we prevent these types of situations where we go queenless is we make sure that we're monitoring during those times that are really important. And that 3-day period to be able to determine when we have a queen and when we don't, that egg laying period. So, if you come to a colony and doesn't have any eggs in it, there's no queen there. If you have and the other one does have eggs, the queen is in there, and you actually don't even have to find her at that point. The last part of that is if you catch, yes, the hives will be okay if you catch it in a couple days. Again, they're either going to, if you leave them a frame of eggs, which every good split should have, frame of eggs, frame of capped brood, frame of pollen, frame of honey, and a frame to build on. As long as you have those, the nice thing about doing splits that way is there's very little risk that you're going to come into a situation with no queen, because even if the queen fails for some reason, you still, or a queen was not there in the first place, as long as they have eggs, they can raise a queen. Next question, how are you ensuring that the old queen didn't get overlooked and transferred into the nuke? So I think I just covered that. So I won't go back to that. So again, if you do a split, you can't find the queen, come back in 3 days. One of them's going to have eggs, one of them's not. But both of them should have had eggs in there when you made the split. So regardless if you have a queen or not, they should be able to raise their own queen. All right, next question is, I made 2 split nukes, and for some reason they didn't make a queen. Not sure why, but I now have laying workers and a bunch of drones. What do I do to save the nukes? I wanted them to make their own queens, so I didn't give them one. Okay, so this is a great question. In the laying workers video, I think that went out with the swarms section, laying workers, when we get laying workers, this is called a hopelessly queenless situation, and it is exactly as dire as it sounds. There is no way at this point, when you have laying workers, that these colonies will get queen right. You could add a queen, they're just going to kill it. There's no way that they are going to get queen right. The only way that you are going to be able to rectify this situation is by combining them with a queen right colony. So your queen right colonies that you took those splits off of, what you're going to do is you're going to take a piece of newspaper, you're going to put it on top of the colonies that are queen right. So open the top cover, you're right on top of the hive body, put the piece of newspaper down, and then take your colony that has laying workers and set it right on top of that newspaper. What will happen is, over the course of the next couple days, they'll eat through that newspaper, and those two colonies will combine. The reason we put newspaper in place is it's to let those workers that are being introduced to the queen right colony get familiar with those queen pheromones before they have a chance to merge, so that there's no chance that they would go after the queen. So that's a pretty, that's the only solution for that problem. Whenever you get into a situation where you have a laying worker, the only solution to that problem is combining it with a queen right colony. You can split it again later. You can try again later once they combine and split it again. But if you don't do it, you're just going to lose your bees. And there's no sense in doing that. Just add them to another colony, let them get queen right. And then, like I said, if you want to try a split again, try it at a later date once those are all kind of back together as one colony. All right, Steve, I wanted to point out, Steve had an awesome question, and I love being called out on things. So, recording these videos as part of the workshop series is very new to me. And to record like an hour-long video, if I make a mistake in between where I catch myself saying something, I have to go back and do a bunch more recording and editing to fix that. So I generally, I try to do these in one take. So it's kind of like you're seeing the full experience. Steve caught me saying something and doing something that was incorrect by textbook standards, and I want to call Steve out for doing that. I really appreciate that. So what happened was, while I was doing the splits lecture, when I was introducing queens, I was putting the queen cage with the candy plug down, and this is something that has likely gotten to be, well, it was basically, I was talking and going through things and really wasn't paying attention to what I was doing. And I went back to the video, and sure enough, that's exactly what I said. So there's 2 ways of thought around this. Steve is absolutely right. The queen cage, the candy end should be facing up. The reason that should be facing up is in case you get dead attendants. If attendants die, oftentimes they can block the entrance where that candy plug is. Now, For those of us who do queen introductions and then do manual releases, that's not generally a big deal. But from the textbook way, that is always the way that you should be doing it. So I appreciate Steve calling that out. I appreciate you all paying attention to what I'm saying, because sometimes things slip by me. And even when I'm reviewing these videos, oftentimes I'm not, like I said, oftentimes there's a lot of video to go through and I may miss little things. But that was a good thing to catch, Steve. So I appreciate that. We ever catch each other somewhere, you know, at a conference or something, come up to me and let me know. We'll have a drink together, because that was a good catch. I really appreciate that. All right, so moving on. But yeah, Steve was absolutely right there, and I apologize for having that in there. It will work either way, though. If you're going back and doing a manual release, it really doesn't matter which direction it's facing. But if you're relying on the queen or on the workers to release the queen, facing up would be the proper way to do that. All right, pests and pathogens. Let's get into this. All right, pests and pathogens. Will bees get into diatomaceous earth when spread out on the ground around the hive, or if you use it around the ground around various crops? I've always been a little hesitant to use it around crops because I read bees will get into it, and also read that bees' fur actually helps prevent them from getting into it. Okay, this is a really interesting question, because diatomaceous earth is a product that can be used for all sorts of things around beehives. So one of the things that you can use it for is you can put it around your hive stand to prevent ants getting up into the bees. You can also put it out around the front of the hive to help with small hive beetle as they're dropping out to pupate into the ground, because they pupate in the ground in front of the colonies. So that's another thing you can help with diatomaceous earth. Diatomaceous earth is essentially like crushed up seashells, and what it does is it basically it perforates the exoskeleton of insects. So it basically cuts them through their exoskeleton and causes them to die that way. It's very effective in organic gardening, typically around vegetable crops and things like that. It does have very limited activity, because once it gets wet, it's totally useless. So if you put it out and it rains the next day, it's gone. But it is really good from an organic standpoint. There are some problems with around bees. So generally you want to use, if you're going to use it, using it around the immediate hive is not a big issue, because typically you don't have a lot of bees walking around the hive in front of your hive. You shouldn't be, definitely, especially if it's elevated, and you should always have it on some sort of a stand. So you shouldn't, it's generally not an issue right around the immediate area of the hive. Around agricultural crops, it could be more of a risk. Bees will forage, particularly early in the season, will forage on the ground, both for water and for pollen resources on the ground. So if they interact with it at all, it will hurt them. The interesting thing about this, as far as their fur being able to help them not get into it, I have never read that. And I would find that surprising. And the reason for this is this. So bees, as an organism, they're outside of the fur on their body has a positive charge. And pollen, the reason that pollen attaches to them is because pollen has a negative charge. So positive and negative are going to attract. And so when the bees get into the flowers, as they're brushing up against the pollen that's on those male flower parts, as they're brushing up against that pollen actually kind of attracts to them because of that charge difference. Now, it's a very weak charge, but they do attract. Now, diatomaceous earth has a high negative charge. And so my instinct would tell me, and my background would tell me, that because diatomaceous earth has a negative charge on its surface, that it would actually attract to bees more readily. And I would imagine that also has to go into with the other insects that it controls as well, because a lot of insects do have positive charges on them. So that's something to think about. But I would say, if you're going to use it, use it around the crops use them around the ground. Generally, you don't have to put it everywhere, because if you're dealing with it as a pesticide, or as a thing to kill pests, you can locate it right around the stems of the plants that the pests would be coming to. Now, it's only ground pests that this is going to prevent. So things like earwigs, those types of organisms, cutworms, as they're coming up through the ground to feed on the top parts of the plant, would interact with it. So it's ground-dwelling insects is the only thing it controls. So as long as it's on the ground, kind of around the immediate areas of the bases of the plants, I don't think you're going to have much of an issue with it harming your bees. So it's a very safe chemical or product to use. It's not a chemical. Like I said, it's ground up seashells. But if bees are interacting, you wouldn't want to put it, say, on the surface of a plant, number one, because that's not how you apply it. But number two, because that's where, where insects like bees are going to more readily interact with it. All right, the next question. I have a 2-mile or 5-mile electric fence. Sorry, I'm working off of 2 screens here. Okay, so I have a 2-mile or 5-mile electric fence to keep out small animals from my apiary. I don't know how much deterrence that is for a bear, but I also have small children around. Do you know how much fence charger is safe for kids to be around? This is an interesting question. So I don't know. So when it gets to electrical fences, it's not really I know that they're rated by 2-mile, 5-mile, 120-mile electric fences. The rating that you want to pay attention to is the joule rating. So generally, you want a minimum of about 1 joule to prevent, at least 1 joule to prevent bears from getting into an apiary. Now, a motivated bear will get through that fence, no problem. So it's a deterrent. I don't know what's safe for kids to be around. I was a kid who grew up on farms, and I got hit by some pretty strong electrical fences as a kid. They're not going to kill you. They're going to zap you, but they're not terribly harmful. It's not something that's going to kill a child. But if you're worried about your kids being around the electric fence, I would encourage you maybe to put a perimeter around it, so that the kids can't immediately interact with the fence. But if you're concerned about protecting your bees, you need to have a pretty strong fence. For example, your bees are worth quite a lot of money. I generally estimate, if you were looking at this from like an insurance standpoint, your hives are worth about $1,000 a piece. Now, a small apiary, with maybe 2 bee colonies, that's $2,000 that you've got invested there. A bear will destroy that entire investment in 1 evening. And so you want to make sure that investment is protected. For your kids, teaching them about the importance of respecting things like that would be important too. Because, if they are growing up around livestock like bees, this is going to be something that they're going to be around. And it's important for kids that are growing up on farms to know that things are at risk. I mean, I was driving a tractor at a very young age, and it was instilled upon me at a very young age how dangerous equipment like tractors are. So, if they're growing up in that kind of a setting, it's a good conversation to have with them just to understand how we manage livestock, why it's there, and why we shouldn't be touching it. But for example, again, that investment's really important. For me, in my perspective, I want to make sure that investment's protected the best I possibly can. So we have about $60,000 worth of bees in our apiary. One night, I could lose that entire investment if it wasn't properly protected. And I live in heavy bear country. Our fence is a 6.5 joule fence. It's the strongest fence that Tractor Supply offers. And it's something that's got a lot of punch to it. I've used lower, like 1 joule fences. You can put your hand on a 1 joule fence and it'll hit, but it's not very hard. And the reason that you look at the joule rating is because that's how hard it hits. So for example, you could have like 2 7,000 volt units. One's like a 0.25 joules and one's a 1 joule fence. The 0.25 joule, even though it's rated the same volts, will hit much, much softer than the 1 joule fence. So when you're looking at these, you want to look at the joule rating. And like I said, you want a minimum of 1 joule. And I know those 2-mile and 5-mile electric fences generally are like, I don't know, like like 0.05 joules. So much less than you actually need. Again, it's protecting your investment. If you lose that, if those bears get in there, there is going to be a massive amount of damage that takes place, and whether you can recover from that or not is important to recognize. But I would say err on the hotter fence, and let the kids know that that's just not something that they want to interact with, or like I said, put up some sort of a barrier around that electrical fence so that the kids can't interact with it at all. But I really don't know what the rating is for for kids to be safe around. Like I said, I've been hit by a lot of electrical fences in my day, and none of them ever did any permanent damage. No burns or anything like that. They just sting for a moment, and I don't know. I learned my lesson the hard way, I guess. All right, the next question is, the instructions for MitoWay Quick Strips and Formic Pro state that screen bottom board should be closed off during treatment to prevent formic acid vapor loss. How is this accomplished? So the piece of board that slides in that you use with your screen bottom board, that's what they mean by closing it up. You put the bottom, that it's usually like a corrugated plastic, but you put that slide in. A lot of folks will leave that out. We have probably, I don't know, a dozen screen bottom boards in our apiary that are way, way old. I've lost most of those inserts. So when we do formic acid treatments on those hives, generally what I do is I will political signs that you see around make great inserts for screen bottom boards. So usually I'll have to find something to put in place when we do our treatments. But those are things that do get lost pretty easily. But yeah, you're basically just putting in that piece of corrugated plastic to seal off that bottom. And the reason for that is that MitoWay Quick Strips and Formic Pro, formic acid it's a volatile, and it's very heavy. It's heavier than air, so it sinks. And so if you have that screen bottom board wide open, it's just going to sink out of the hive. And so by having that plastic in there, it's going to help prevent that. Is there a reason we don't use Apis cerana instead of European bees since they deal with Varroa better? Great question. So Apis cerana is actually kept as a honeybee in Asia. The reason that it's not here in the United States is because, well, we were settled by European settlers, and they had Apis mellifera. So the reason we don't keep this bee is a reflection of colonization. There are no native honeybees in the United States, so this was brought over with colonizers, and that is why we have it. Apis cerana is kept as a honeybee in areas of Asia. You will never see it come in the United States, I guarantee you, because the way insects used to move around the world, let's say pre-industrial revolution, pre-green revolution, it used to be where you could just pretty much bring anything anywhere. It's not like that anymore. And I would be very surprised if USDA ever allowed Apis cerana in the United States as an introduced honeybee species. We already have Apis mellifera. It does pretty much everything we need in the way of pollination. Apis cerana, no, I would be very surprised if that were ever to be allowed by current USDA standards. We just don't allow that kind of movement of insects free, like willy-nilly around the world anymore. And the reason is because we don't know what happens. So oftentimes, if you were to introduce a species of an insect into the United States, there is a very big process that goes behind that. And pretty much the only species of insects that we allow to be introduced into the United States any longer are predatory and parasitic insects that control pests that are invasives. So for example, we have the citrus psyllid, Asian citrus psyllid, which is decimating the U.S. Citrus industry. Where I grew up in California, the Riverside area is like the hub of fresh eating oranges in the United States. There's more orange groves there than pretty much anywhere. Florida does most of your juice oranges. So what's happened over the course of it's only been about maybe 10 years, this psyllid, which is a small sap-sucking or a phloem-sucking insect, so it sucks the sap or the sugary substances out of citrus trees. This psyllid was introduced in the United States, likely came from Asia, and because of global trade, so it came on something that was shipped from Asia, got introduced into the United States in both Florida and in California. And in Florida, it's pretty much wiped out half of the citrus industry. And it vectors a disease called citrus greening virus, which basically kills the trees over time. So in order to head this off, the reason that it's an invasive species, and the reason it's such a problem is because when invasive species get introduced into an area, there is no what we call natural enemy community. There's no other insects that eat that insects because they're not co-evolved. So, and it's the same with Varroa mite, because Varroa mite's not co-evolved with Apis mellifera. We have an issue where the bee has no idea that it's even dealing with a pest. And so in this situation with Asian citrus psyllid, because that psyllid came into the United States and no predators or parasitoid insects which attack them and feed on them are controlling them, they just explode and get out of control and can wipe out entire industries. When that happens, that's when the USDA allows for importation of insects. And what they do is they send individuals. There's a professor at the University of California, Riverside, who is a foreign explorer. He basically goes to other countries and seeks out. He'll go to, say, for example, with Asian citrus psyllid. He went back to the area of Asia where this psyllid is native to and has been hunting for the organisms that feed on them. And then what they do is they collect usually parasitic wasps. These little tiny wasps are what they generally are looking for. They take a collection of wasps that are eating this particular problem insect. They bring it to the United States and they develop, they basically for the next 10 or 15 years, they will test to make sure that if that insect is released into the United States, it will not harm anything else. Because the worst thing that can happen when you're doing an introduction of an insect like that into a country that it's not native to is if you let it go, if you put it out there in the world, there's no way you're going to catch it back. There's no way you're going to be able to get rid of it. It's going to go. And if it decides that it does not want to do what you want it to do once it gets out there in the environment, there's nothing you can do about it. So there's a lot of research that goes into letting insects go in the United States that are not native to here anymore. And so with Apis cerana, there would have to be a very good case, for it. And I know Varroa being one of them is a good case, but for what we use honeybees for, Apis cerana it's not going to be something that I think that we would ever see introduced here unless we saw a complete collapse of European honeybees in the United States. And maybe then we would see something like that. But yeah, the movement of these organisms around the world is very difficult when it comes to insects because, like I said, once you let them go, you have no idea what's going to happen. Say, for example, we let Apis cerana go, and Apis cerana decides that, okay, I've been let go in this environment, and maybe I like to nest in specific areas that are not good for metropolitan areas of the United States. So, for example, California again, there are all these citrus groves that a lot of them do rely on pollination. You put Apis cerana out there, and maybe Apis cerana decides it doesn't like being in managed beehives and starts nesting in the eaves of homes more prevalently than they do anywhere else. And now it becomes a problem for homeowners, and now you've got a bunch of issues around that. So we have to think ahead about how these things would affect things long term. But the thing that we are doing is that, genetics of Apis cerana are being heavily studied, and we are trying to get the genes that are identified as the Varroa genes. That's where the Varroa sensitive hygienic genes are coming from a lot of times, is that they're identifying genes that lead to Varroa behavior. So things like intensive grooming is one behavior that Varroa sensitive hygienic bees tend to have, is they groom a lot, meaning they're always wiping themselves. And that's one way that they help with controlling Varroa. So they're identifying those genes and trying to make sure that we're getting them into European honeybees. And that's kind of in lieu of importing any sort of new species of bees. All right, alcohol versus sugar roll test. Which do you prefer? Will there be a virtual workshop to show both? Yes, you'll get a workshop showing both this month. So for the longest time, I have been teaching the sugar roll test. They both are effective. I'll say that to start with. The sugar roll test is a little harder to do right. And that's what I've noticed over the years of teaching it, is that oftentimes people don't shake hard enough or shake too hard. If you don't shake hard enough, it doesn't dislodge, you're not really shaking out any mites. If you shake too hard, oftentimes the bees will actually react by starting to release venom, which cakes up your powdered sugar, and then which doesn't make for a good test. So powdered sugar roll just takes a little time to get used to. The advantage of the powdered sugar roll is you don't kill any bees. The alcohol wash, you're killing about 300 bees. However, the alcohol wash does have it's a much easier test to do. It's pretty much foolproof. So you put bees in the jar, you add alcohol, you shake them vigorously, the mites separate from the dead bees, and you're able to count very easily. So it's a much more foolproof test. For those of you who are really concerned about killing 300 bees, I would caution you to just think of it this way. That colony of 30 or 40,000 bees, you're taking a small sample of those bees to make sure that the rest of that colony is able to survive. I don't like killing bees more than anybody else, but I will say over the course of last year, I did some just testing on my own, and oftentimes the alcohol wash. So what I was doing is I was doing a powdered sugar roll, and then I would do an alcohol wash with the same bees right after I did the sugar roll to see if I get any more mites off. And more often than not, I would get one or two more mites. Now that could make the difference between doing a treatment and not doing a treatment. But when the powdered sugar roll is done right, it generally is very accurate. But I would say if you're concerned about that technique, definitely the alcohol wash is the easiest way to go. I will demonstrate both for you this month though. All right, last two questions. I had a discussion with a nearby beekeeper who indicates his two worst issues were Varroa and wax moths. I did some research, searching, and found this article on wax moths. It's interesting and answered several questions. So there's a link to this article. I would caution you, the article is from Australia. And so with wax moths, generally wax moths can be an issue. They're typically a storage pest. So wax moths are things that affect your stored materials generally. It's a late season pest, so we don't see it come out a lot in the beginning of the season. It's more of a late season pest. And like I said, it's more a storage pest than anything. Typically, strong colonies do not succumb to wax moths and don't usually have issues with wax moths. Weak colonies absolutely will. And if Varroa is an issue for this individual where they're losing bees year after year to Varroa problems, a compromised colony with Varroa may have wax moths that get into it. But strong healthy colonies should not have a problem fighting off wax moths. From the storage angle, it is absolutely a problem. And most of the time, people get wax moths because they store frames with pollen in them. And I've talked about this previously in previous lectures when we talk about stored materials. If you leave frames stored, so say you have a dead out, or you have equipment at the end of the season that is left over from a dead colony, and you just set it aside because you think, oh, I'm going to just use that next season. You need to go through those frames. And if you have frames with pollen in them, you need to get rid of them. And you can scrape the frames, you can burn the frames, whatever you want to do with them. But you need to get rid of that pollen in those stored situations because it's not the wax that they go after. I know we call them wax moths, but Galeria moths are not feeding on wax. They are feeding on pollen. They're there for the protein substance. So they're there to eat that protein. And they lay their eggs in there because that's what they're going to be feeding on, is all of that protein. It's basically like a buffet for wax moth larvae. They do foul up the wax intensively, which is probably why they were originally called wax moths. But they're absolutely feeding on the pollen that's being stored. So the way that you mitigate wax moth issues with stored equipment is get rid of those pollen frames. You look at it this way: a frame costs what, maybe $1, $2. That's not a hard thing to replace. But if you get an entire, stack of boxes that are fouled with wax moth, that drawn comb that is like gold, all getting fouled up with all of that nasty webbing, that's more of a loss than a $2 frame, right? I mean, so we just have to think about this in terms of, what is it going to harm? And it's just like with the bear fence. I could invest in a very inexpensive fence that hardly hits at all, and I could feel confident it's going to work, but is it actually going to work? Maybe I should have made that better investment on the hotter hitting fence so that it prevented those bears. Same situation here. If you lose a little bit of money because you're getting rid of some pollen frames, that's a lot less money than losing an entire apiary or an entire stack of hive bodies with drawn comb to wax moth. All right, the last question for today. Have you encouraged or have you encountered neighbors who are natural beekeepers and refuse to treat? What options might you suggest to deal with this issue? Keeping it legal, of course. I wouldn't want to start a range war. Well, to be honest, you just having a discussion with them probably might work. Maybe it won't. Natural beekeepers tend to be pretty firm in their beliefs that they can solve this problem without any sort of issues related to controlling Varroa. So they think they can figure this out. I have yet to meet a natural beekeeper that has been very successful. I know there's a couple of them on the internet that do this professionally, that speak very highly about their approaches. A lot of natural beekeepers, unless they are really keen on things like brood breaks, removing drone brood, things like that, a lot of them are completely hands-off, which is dangerous. the natural beekeepers who are doing the right things, like creating natural brood breaks, removing drone comb, some of them are actually keeping very low numbers of varroa mite. But most natural beekeepers who I've ever met, especially newer beekeepers, they're hands-off beekeepers. They feel like the colony is just going to work it out themselves. That's not what's going to happen. So if you do have natural beekeepers around you, really the best thing you can do, if they are not someone that's going to treat, is just monitor your bees constantly for varroa mite and treat when necessary. Unfortunately, that's really the main option if they're not going to be treating. I was in a situation in Lansing where we had an apiary that was between the state capitol and MSU's campus. And it was our strongest apiary. We got a lot of good honey out of there. And we had a beginning beekeeper who was local in the neighborhood because we were in an urban area, who was a natural beekeeper. And that individual, I can't say for sure, but what happens a lot of times is that when varroa mite gets so high in the fall that the bees just can't deal with the pressure, they will abscond the hive. So they'll just up and leave a hive, and they'll go join another colony oftentimes. And what will happen in those situations is you could have a colony that's completely managed correctly, low varroa mite numbers, that gets inundated with this varroa bomb that basically joins the hive. In those situations, we had that happen a couple years ago to a hive that I had for 5 years that was one of our strongest producing hives, always had varroa under control because we monitor every 3 weeks and treat when necessary. And when we went into the fall, when we did our last mite inspection, which was kind of I think if I remember correctly, it was like the beginning of October was when we had done our last inspection for count. And the colony had very low varroa mite numbers going into there, so winter bees were doing very good. But because we were keeping two farm locations that year, we had spent some time up here at the farm in the UP, and I just was going to let that colony go into winter and do its thing like it always did. But what happened was that colony had one of these varroa bombs that joined it, who I suspect was from this natural beekeeper who was in our neighborhood, because we kind of knew who each other were, who were keeping bees in that area. And it took out the colony. When I did an autopsy on that colony the following spring, the varroa mite load that was just present in the colony, I mean, varroa mites all over the frames, varroa mites all over the bottom board, varroa mite just everywhere in this colony. That individual took out, likely took out one of my best colonies. It is a thing that does happen. And so just if you're in that situation where you've got natural beekeepers who refuse to treat, unless they are really on their game with those natural techniques like I talked about, brood breaks, removing drone comb, unless they're actively doing those types of things constantly, that's a tough situation to be in. You're just going to have to monitor your mites and make sure that you're treating your bees when necessary, because they will interact with each other in the landscape. And those bees that are coming out of that neighbor's hive, the way that varroa works in a lot of its transfer, as these phoretic mites that are moving around in the landscape, they basically are hitching rides on bees, bees land on a flower, the mite hops off, waits for another bee to come, and so your bees visit that flower after your neighbor's bees were there, and they're going to jump onto your bees and come back to your colony with you. So just make sure you're monitoring as best you can. If you're friendly with them, maybe it's time to talk about education with them and talk about varroa mite a little more candidly. If it's someone who maybe you don't have that relationship with, then make sure you're watching your bees consistently. All right, that's all the questions we got for today. All right, I really appreciate all your time today. I'm working on videos. Rain just stopped here, so I'm probably going to get out in the apiary and try to make another video today. I appreciate all of your input and your feedback about these videos. This has not been an easy year for any of us. This is something I would much rather do face-to-face. It is much easier to give you a 3-hour lecture than spend 12 hours developing a video. I'll say that much. But I really appreciate the feedback that you all have been sending about these videos. It is my first time kind of going into that area of instruction. We do the whole PowerPoint thing a lot, but filming that stuff on camera for you all has been a new experience. So I appreciate the patience. I appreciate the feedback. And if you do see something wrong, you know, for those of you who are more experienced beekeepers, you know, I do go through these videos pretty intensely, but Steve caught something this time, and I appreciate that, Steve. So if you do see something, definitely call it out on the comments section, and I'll be happy to address it. I again appreciate everything y'all are doing for bees. I hope you enjoyed the Michigan Natural Features Inventory uh, lecture. The bumblebee surveys, that's a really cool opportunity to get out there in the landscape, you know, with your kids, with your grandkids, getting them to learn a little bit about bumblebees and some of the native bees that we have here in Michigan. So, all right, thank you all very much. Have a great rest of your June. July is almost upon us, and I will get some videos to you likely next week or just shortly after there for all of this month's virtual workshops. All right, have a good one.